The silence inside the custom Rolls-Royce Phantom was a physical presence, as thick and oppressive as the San Francisco fog pressing against the bulletproof glass. It was a cold, gray Tuesday, the kind of day where the sky wept a fine mist that wasn't quite rain, and the mournful groan of a distant foghorn echoed across the bay. I stared out at the ghostly silhouettes of the city, the lights of the financial district blurring into long, sorrowful streaks of amber and white. Beside me, my husband, Spencer, was a portrait of simmering impatience. He wasn't grieving his father's death. He was waiting for it to be monetized. Dressed in a razor-sharp Tom Ford suit, a funereal black that somehow looked more predatory than somber, he tapped a perfectly manicured finger against the edge of his phone, where the stock market ticker was already running. He hadn't shed a single tear for his father, Theodore. In the weeks since Theodore Montgomery had passed away, Spencer's only discernible emotion had been a poorly disguised, almost manic excitement. "Is this driver being paid by the hour?" he muttered, the sound tight with irritation. He glanced at his platinum Vacheron Constantin, a watch his father had given him for his 30th birthday. "Covington is a stickler for punctuality. This is the most important meeting of my life. We cannot be late." "We'll be there, Spencer," I said, my voice barely a whisper, easily absorbed by the thick wool carpeting and plush luster interior. My own grief felt like a cold, heavy stone lodged in my chest. My simple black sheath dress, the one Theodore had complimented at our last Christmas dinner, felt like a costume. He'd squeezed my hand and said, with a twinkle in his eye, "Lillian, you possess a quiet elegance that outshines all the noise in this room." He was the only one who ever said things like that, the only one who saw me at all. Theodore Montgomery had been more of a father to me than my own. He'd seen something in the quiet girl from a modest Sacramento family who had somehow, inexplicably, captured his son's attention 10 years ago. He taught me how to play chess, patiently explaining the long game. He taught me how to appreciate the complex notes in a vintage Napa Cabernet. And most importantly, he'd always encouraged me to stand up for myself, a lesson I was still struggling to learn, especially when it came to his son. "You're uncharacteristically quiet," Spencer noted, his tone not one of concern, but of clinical observation, as if I were a faulty piece of equipment. "Still moping? Lillian, for God's sake, he was 82. He had a great run. Now it's time for the next generation to take the reins of Montgomery Industries and propel it into the future." The next generation was a euphemism for him and him alone. He saw his father's vast empire, a titan of manufacturing and global logistics, as his divine birthright. For the past 5 years, Spencer had treated his position as executive vice president as a tiresome placeholder, a gilded waiting room for the CEO chair. He treated me with the same provisional tolerance. The loving glances of our early years had long been replaced by critical, assessing stares. The sweet nothings had curdled into cutting remarks about my lack of killer instinct. I knew all about Chloe, the sleek, ambitious Wharton graduate in the marketing department he was grooming for a role that had nothing to do with company business. I'd seen the late-night texts, the hotel receipts he'd carelessly left in his coat pocket. I knew he was just waiting for the ink on his father's will to dry before he served me with divorce papers. He thought I was a fool, too timid and too dependent to see the truth. Perhaps I was. I had stayed, clinging to the ghost of the man I'd married and the genuine, deep affection I held for the man who was now gone. "I just think it's a sad day," I managed to say, my voice tight. "He was your father." He scuffed, a short, sharp sound of derision that echoed his father's absence. "It's a transitional day, Lillian, a necessary one. Business is about moving forward, not looking back. For heaven's sake, try to look composed. The entire family will be watching. You represent me." He adjusted his silk tie, his reflection staring back at him from the polished walnut trim of the car's interior. He looked at himself the way he looked at his portfolio, with an air of smug ownership and boundless expectation. He had absolutely no idea that his father, the brilliant, sharp-witted man who missed nothing, had been watching too. The law offices of Covington, Thorne & West occupied the top 3 floors of a skyscraper that pierced the fog, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the Golden Gate Bridge and the churning gray waters around Alcatraz. The reception area was a symphony of old money and quiet power. Hand-rubbed mahogany walls, plush leather chairs the color of rich earth, and a massive, abstract dive-in corn that probably cost more than my parents' entire retirement fund. The air smelled of old books, expensive floor wax, and freshly brewed Peet's coffee. This was Theodore's world, solid, powerful, and profoundly intimidating. A solemn receptionist with a voice like brushed velvet led us to the main conference room, where the Montgomery clan was already assembled in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 and resentment. My sister-in-law, Beatrice, gave me a look that could freeze the bay. She was a carbon copy of Spencer in both ambition and avarice, her severe designer suit a declaration of her perceived status as the family's matriarch in waiting. Her husband, a timid gentleman named Gregory, offered a weak, apologetic nod in my direction. A few cousins and an elderly Aunt Matilda were scattered around the long, imposing table, their faces a carefully curated mask of sorrow stretched thinly over undisguised greed. Spencer strode in like he owned the place, which, in his mind, he already did. He clapped the cousin on the back with forced camaraderie, offered a plastic, airbrushed smile to his aunt, and took the seat at the opposite head of the table from the lawyer's chair. It was a blatant power move, positioning himself as the heir apparent, the new king. I chose a seat to his right, feeling small and utterly out of place, a field mouse at a gathering of eagles. I could feel their eyes on me, the silent consensus hanging heavy and suffocating in the air. The mousy middle-class girl who had married into a dynasty, soon to be pensioned off and disposed of like a retired racehorse. "Lillian, darling," Aunt Matilda chirped, her voice dripping with the condescending pity she reserved for the staff and me. "So terribly sorry for your loss. Theodore was always so very fond of you. It was rather sweet of him, wasn't it?" The subtext was as sharp as a stiletto. His fondness for me was a quaint eccentricity, a puzzling hobby for an otherwise brilliant man. "Thank you, Matilda." "He was very good to me," I replied, my voice miraculously steady. Spencer, playing the magnanimous host of a party no one else was enjoying, signaled to an assistant. "Can we get some water for everyone? And let's please get this started. No sense in prolonging the inevitable. Time is money, after all." His gaze swept the room, a king surveying his court, satisfied with their fealty. He was so confident, so utterly certain of the outcome. He believed his father, a man he viewed as a traditionalist, would do the predictable patriarchal thing, leave the lion's share to his only son to carry on the Montgomery name and business. The idea that Theodore might have had other more creative plans was so far outside Spencer's realm of comprehension, it simply didn't exist. He caught my eye and gave me a tight, conspiratorial smile that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a smile of partnership. It was a smile of dismissal, of finality. "Enjoy your last day as Mrs. Montgomery," it seemed to say. I folded my hands in my lap, my knuckles white, and stared at the polished, reflective surface of the table, waiting for the axe to fall. I just had no idea whose neck it was meant for. Mr. Covington entered the room, and a hush fell over the assembly. He was a tall, stoic man in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 confidential secrets. He had been Theodore's lawyer for 50 years, but more than that, he had been his closest friend and confidant. He placed a thick, leather-bound portfolio on the table, the sound echoing with finality in the silent room. He gave a brief, formal nod to the family before his eyes settled on me for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary, a flicker of something unreadable. Pity? Sympathy? Warning in his gaze. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded effortless attention. "We are here today to execute the last will and testament of Theodore James Montgomery. Before I begin, I want to state for the record that Theodore was my dearest friend, and his clarity of mind, his legendary acuity, was sharp and undiminished until the very end. This document was reviewed and signed 6 months ago, in the presence of 2 witnesses and with a psychiatrist's full written attestation of his sound mental state." My eyes shot to Spencer. Why would Mr. Covington feel the need to so pointedly preempt any challenge to Theodore's competence? Spencer, however, didn't seem to notice or care, too busy radiating an aura of impatient entitlement. The lawyer began with the smaller, preliminary bequests: a generous 7-figure donation to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, a collection of rare first-edition books on maritime history to a university archive, a charming seaside cottage in Carmel by the Sea to Aunt Matilda, who let out a little theatrical gasp of delight, a vintage Patek Philippe watch to Beatrice's husband, Gregory, who looked genuinely shocked and deeply touched, a rare moment of sincere emotion in the room. With each item read, the tension in the room ratcheted up. These were the appetizers, the table scraps. Everyone was waiting for the main course, the disposition of Montgomery Industries and the vast 9-figure estate that came with it. Spencer leaned back in his chair, a look of supreme, almost comical boredom on his handsome face. He drummed his fingers on the table, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap, a physical manifestation of his self-assuredness. He believed this was all just tedious pageantry he had to endure before his coronation. I, on the other hand, was filled with a growing, nauseating sense of dread. The end of this meeting signified the end of my marriage, the end of my life as I knew it. I braced myself for the public humiliation I knew was coming, for the pitying looks from the family and the final, cold dismissal from the man sitting beside me. Under the table, Spencer had his phone out, discreetly scrolling through what looked like financial reports, already managing the empire he had yet to inherit. Mr. Covington paused and took a slow, deliberate sip of water. He put on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses and looked down at the final, crucial pages of the will. "And now," he said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing every ounce of attention in the room to him, "we come to the primary assets of the estate. This includes all shares, properties, liquid assets, and the controlling interest in Montgomery Industries." Spencer sat up ramrod straight, his phone instantly forgotten. His smug, self-satisfied grin he'd been suppressing finally broke free, spreading across his face like a sunrise. This was it, the moment of his ascension. He risked a glance at me, a flicker of absolute triumph in his eyes, before turning his full attention to the lawyer, ready to receive his kingdom. The air in the room grew thick and heavy with anticipation, so dense it felt hard to breathe. Every eye, greedy and expectant, was on Mr. Covington. Spencer's grin was a permanent fixture now, a polished mask of ultimate victory. He looked like a man who had just crossed the finish line of a race he'd been running his entire life, a race he believed he was born to win. Mr. Covington took another slow, deliberate breath, his gaze sweeping over the family one last time, over Beatrice's hungry stare, over Aunt Matilda's feigned solemnity, before landing, with pointed and unsettling significance, on me. He wasn't looking at Spencer, the heir apparent. He was looking directly at me. "I will read this next section precisely as Theodore wrote it," Mr. Covington announced, his voice steady and clear, a surgeon's scalpel cutting through the silence. He was most insistent on the exact wording. He cleared his throat, a small, dry sound that seemed to echo off the high coffered ceilings. The thick parchment of the will rustled in his hands. "To my beloved son, Spencer," he began, and I saw Spencer's chest puff out almost imperceptibly, a peacock displaying its feathers. "I leave my fondest hopes that he will one day learn the profound difference between intrinsic value and market price. I leave him the memory of our many games of chess, and the fervent hope that he will finally understand that every single move, especially those made in arrogance, has an inescapable consequence." A palpable wave of confusion rippled through the room. This wasn't the traditional language of inheritance. It was the sharp, didactic language of a final posthumous lecture. Spencer's grin tightened at the edges, a flicker of profound annoyance crossing his features. He clearly thought this was just some of his father's typical philosophical nonsense, a moralizing preamble before the real announcement of his inheritance. He waved a dismissive hand, as if to say, "Yes, yes, lesson learned, now get on with it." Mr. Covington's expression remained stony as he continued, his voice unwavering. He paused for a long, dramatic beat, letting the weight of the next words settle before he spoke them. "And now, for the bulk of my estate, the entirety of my life's work, and the future of my legacy. To my daughter-in-law, Lillian Montgomery." He paused again, and the room was so utterly still I could hear my own heart pounding, a frantic, terrified rhythm in my ears. My name? Why was he saying my name? I felt a dozen pairs of eyes, sharp as daggers, swiveling to stare at me. I shrank in my seat, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. This had to be a mistake. It had to be some cruel, elaborate, and deeply unfunny joke. Then Mr. Covington looked up from the page, over the rim of his glasses, and directly at Spencer, before reading the final, fateful line from Theodore's will. "To my daughter-in-law, I leave the one thing my son truly loves." Silence. Not a respectful silence, but a deep, profound, and utterly baffled silence. It was as if Theodore had spoken a riddle from beyond the grave. Aunt Matilda's brow was furrowed in a mask of comical confusion. Beatrice stared at the lawyer as if he'd started speaking in tongues. I looked at Spencer, completely lost. His smug grin had faltered, crumbling into an expression of pure, unadulterated bewilderment. He looked at me, then at the lawyer, then back at me, his mind clearly racing and coming up empty. What could it possibly mean? What was the one thing he truly loved that his father could give me? A car? A painting from the house? The cryptic, almost poetic nature of the clause hung in the air, a ticking bomb of meaning that no one in the room, least of all me, yet understood. Spencer's bewilderment lasted only for a moment before his deep-seated, lifelong arrogance reasserted itself like a reflex. He let out a short, dismissive laugh, a brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes. He shook his head as if his father had just told a particularly corny and sentimental joke at a dinner party. He processed it as a symbolic flourish, a final poetic quirk from a sentimental old man who'd always had a perplexing soft spot for his daughter-in-law. The actual legal transfer of assets to him, he believed, was still a foregone conclusion. He leaned over to me, his movement sharp and proprietary, his voice a low, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. His breath smelled of expensive coffee and pure, undiluted contempt. "Don't you dare get any ideas, Lillian," he hissed, his smug grin returning, but this time it was laced with a chilling cruelty. "It's obviously some kind of trinket, a symbolic gesture to make you feel included. The old man was always soft on you, God knows why. He patted my hand in a gesture that was meant to look reassuring and husbandly to the rest of the room, but felt like the brand of a hot iron on my skin. It's probably his first edition of The Grapes of Wrath. He knew you liked all those dusty, worthless books. I stared at him, my mind still reeling from the bizarre cryptic clause. But his next words sliced through my confusion and struck me with the force of a physical blow. Just play along, look appropriately sad, and don't make a scene, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a venomous hiss. But I want to be perfectly, crystal clear. The moment this meeting is over and the Montgomery fortune is officially in my name, you and I are done. I've already had my lawyer, Stephen, draw up the papers. It's a clean break. I'll be generous, of course. You won't starve. A nice condo with small allowance. But our little arrangement, this decade-long charade, is over. I have wasted enough of my life pretending. It's time for me to be with someone who's on my level, someone like Chloe. The world tilted violently on its axis. I knew it was coming, of course. I had known for months. But to hear it said so coldly, so clinically with the name of his mistress invoked as a weapon in this room, on this day, when my heart was still aching with the fresh, raw grief for the loss of the only true family I had left, it was a special, refined kind of cruelty. The air was knocked from my lungs. I looked at his face, the handsome, chiseled features twisted into a mask of selfish glee, and I finally saw him for what he was. Not the flawed, complicated man I had once loved, but a monster of greed, a hollow shell of a human being who saw people as assets to be acquired and liquidated. My protector, my husband, my executioner. A single tear I couldn't stop slipped down my cheek. A tear not of grief for the death of my marriage, but of pure, unadulterated shock at the sheer depth of his depravity. He saw it, and in his boundless ego, completely misinterpreted as the sorrow of a weak woman about to be discarded. There, he whispered, patting my hands again with that repulsive, condescending gesture. It's for the best, you'll see. You were never cut out for this world anyway. You lack the spine. Then he straightened up, turning his attention back to Mr. Covington with a look that said, "All right, enough with the family games. Give me my money." He was completely, blissfully oblivious, cocooned in a fortress of his own ego, ready to claim a future he had already scripted down to the last detail. Mr. Covington, with his decades of experience reading powerful people, observed the entire whispered exchange between Spencer and me. His face remained impassive, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. Spencer's condescending pat, my visible flinch, and the triumphant, cruel smirk that had followed. He slowly, deliberately removed his reading glasses and placed them on the gleaming mahogany table with a soft, definitive click. He folded his hands and looked directly at Spencer, and his gaze was suddenly as hard and unyielding as the granite of the Sierra Nevada. "You seem to be misunderstanding the situation, Spencer," the lawyer said, his calm, measured voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a razor. "This is not poetry. It is not a symbolic gesture. It is a legally binding directive from the primary shareholder." Theodore was very, very specific. Spencer's smirk finally wavered, a crack in his perfect facade. Specific about what? Giving Lillian a dusty old book? It's a nice, sentimental thought. Now, if you don't mind, let's move on to the actual assets, shall we? We're all very busy people. Mr. Covington didn't even glance at the will. He knew this part by heart. It was clear he and Theodore had gone over it many times. Theodore was a brilliant man, Spencer, a true titan, and his greatest brilliance wasn't in logistics or manufacturing. It was in his ability to see people for precisely who they were, not for who they pretended to be. He saw their passions, their motivations, their all-consuming obsessions. He let that last word hang in the air for a moment, pregnant with meaning, before continuing. He asked himself a simple, devastatingly honest question. What is the one thing, the only thing, that my son truly, deeply, and unconditionally loves above all else? The lawyer's eyes bored into Spencer, who was now looking deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. The smugness was evaporating, like mist in the sun, being replaced by a dawning, sickening unease. He was finally beginning to understand that this was not a game. "It isn't his wife," Mr. Covington said, his gaze flicking to me with a brief, almost imperceptible hint of apology. "It isn't his family legacy. It isn't even the company that bears his name." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was nearly unbearable, a vacuum drawing all the air from the room. Then he delivered the final, devastating, world-shattering blow. "To my daughter-in-law, Lillian, I leave the one thing my son truly, deeply, and unconditionally loves above all else." A collective gasp, sharp and unified, went through the room. It was an audible shockwave. Beatrice's perfectly made-up jaw dropped. Aunt Matilda's hand flew to her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with disbelief. Spencer just stared, his face draining of all color until it was a ghastly, waxy, almost translucent white. The king had been dethroned before he ever even touched the crown. For a full 10 seconds, there was absolute, ringing silence. The only sound was the frantic, desperate pounding in my own ears. Then, Spencer's profound shock curdled into pure, incandescent rage. The blood rushed violently back to his face, turning it a blotchy, furious, dangerous red. "No," he choked out, the words small and weak, a pathetic puff of air. Then, his voice erupting in a roar, he shot to his feet, his heavy chair scraping violently against the floor and nearly toppling over. "No! This is a joke! This has to be a sick, twisted, senile joke!" He jabbed a trembling, accusatory finger first at the implacable Mr. Covington, then at me, his hand shaking with fury. He was senile, an old fool who'd lost his mind, and she did this. She manipulated him. The little gold-digging snake has been whispering poison in his ear for years. Mr. Covington remained perfectly, infuriatingly calm. He had clearly anticipated this very outburst. "As I stated at the beginning of this meeting, Spencer, this will was signed in the presence of witnesses and accompanied by a full psychiatric evaluation confirming Theodore's lucidity and sound state of mind. It is, I assure you, ironclad." With a calm, deliberate motion, he opened a side flap of his briefcase and produced another, thinner document. "Furthermore, this is a letter Theodore wrote, to be read aloud for the family in the specific event that you contested the will in this manner. It details his reasons. Would you like me to read it now?" Spencer paled again, the blood draining from his face as quickly as it had returned. He knew, as I did, what a letter from his father, written under these circumstances, would contain. It would be a full, posthumous, and brutally honest evisceration of his character, his greed, his failures, and most damningly, his infidelities. His sister, Beatrice, finally found her voice, shrill with indignation. "This is an outrage, Mr. Covington, a travesty. Spencer is his son. It is his birthright." "A birthright is a sentiment, Beatrice, not a legal entitlement. Theodore was free to leave his property to whomever he deemed worthy of his trust. He deemed Lillian worthy." All the fury, all the venom in the room then turned on me. I felt like a cornered animal, the focus of a dozen pairs of predatory eyes. But as I looked at Spencer's contorted, desperate face, a strange and wonderful calm washed over me. The fear I had lived with for years, the constant, gnawing fear of his anger, his disapproval, his inevitable abandonment, it was gone. It had simply evaporated. I was no longer dependent on his whims for my survival. Theodore had given me more than a fortune. He had given me a shield forged from his love and the law. Spencer's face crumbled. The rage gave way to a desperate, pathetic, sniveling panic. "Lillian," he pleaded, his voice cracking, trying to force a softness that sounded grotesque. "Lillian, honey, you can't let this happen. We're a team. We're married. Remember? What's yours is mine, right? We can fix this together. We just have to tell them you don't want it. You can refuse it. Give it back to me. It's the right thing to do. It's what's best for the family." The sheer, unmitigated, breathtaking gall of it was almost a physical force. Mere moments after telling me he was divorcing me for his mistress, he was now invoking the sanctity and partnership of our marriage to reclaim his fortune. The irony was so thick, so bitter, I almost choked on it. I looked at this man, my husband, and I felt nothing. Nothing but a profound and sorrowful pity for the hollow, empty thing he had become. His entire world, the only world he had ever valued, had just fallen apart, and it was a prison of his own making. I finally met Spencer's desperate, pleading, terrified eyes. The whole room was watching, a silent jury, waiting for me to crumble, to do the right thing as he had so conveniently defined it, to surrender my power, to give him back his world. But I wasn't looking at him anymore, not really. I was thinking of Theodore. I was thinking of his knowing smiles during our chess games when he'd let me take back a foolish move. I was thinking of his gentle, unwavering encouragement of my love for literature, a passion his own son openly mocked. I was thinking of his unwavering belief in me. He hadn't just given me an inheritance. He had given me a mission. He had trusted me, the quiet girl from Sacramento, to be the guardian and steward of his life's work, a legacy his own son was prepared to squander on vanity, vice, and a woman named Chloe. Slowly, with a deliberation that felt both foreign and deeply natural, I reached out and pulled the thick, heavy, leather-bound portfolio toward me. I placed my hand flat on its cover. The leather was cool and smooth beneath my palm. It felt solid. It felt real. It felt like power. "No, Spencer," I said, and my voice was a revelation. It was clearer and stronger than I had ever heard it. It didn't waver, it didn't break. It resonated with a finality that was absolute. "I think the right thing to do is to honor your father's final wishes." A collective sigh of disbelief, a gasp of defeat from the Montgomerys went through the room. Spencer stared at me as if I had physically struck him, as if I had plunged a knife into his chest. The last vestiges of hope drained from his face, leaving an empty, defeated husk. He sank back into his chair, utterly and completely broken. A king without a kingdom. A man without a soul. Mr. Covington gave me a small, almost imperceptible approving nod. "The documents are all in order, Lillian. My team and I will be at your complete disposal to help you navigate the transition of leadership at Montgomery Industries." He began packing his briefcase with brisk efficiency, the meeting effectively over. The other family members, defeated and resentful, started to file out, casting shocked, hateful, and even a few newly intrigued glances in my direction. They didn't know what to make of me anymore. I was no longer the quiet, insignificant wife. I was the one in charge. As I stood up to leave, my legs surprisingly steady, Mr. Covington handed me a simple, sealed, cream-colored envelope. "Theodore asked me to give this to you personally after everything was done," he said softly, his professional mask slipping for a moment to reveal the warm eyes of a friend. I clutched a letter in my hand and walked out of the conference room, my head held high. I did not look back at Spencer. I didn't need to. I could feel his stare on my back, a burning mixture of pure hatred and pathetic, desperate need. In the quiet, echoing marble hallway, I paused by the great window overlooking the bay and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of thick, elegant stationery filled with Theodore's familiar, strong, elegant handwriting. "My dearest Lillian," it read, "if you are reading this, then I have done what I must. Forgive an old man for placing such a heavy and unexpected burden upon your shoulders, but in the end, there was no one else I could trust with my life's work. He loves my money, but I love you. Do good with it. Be strong. And finally, my dear girl, live for yourself. It is your turn. Your checkmate, my dear. With all my love and admiration, Theodore." A single, genuine tear rolled down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or shock, but of overwhelming, cleansing gratitude. I walked out of the building and into the gray San Francisco afternoon. The fog was beginning to lift, and a pale, watery sun was breaking through the clouds over the bay. For the first time in 10 years, I felt the sun on my face, and I knew, with an absolute and bone-deep certainty, that my whole world hadn't fallen apart. It had just, finally, begun.